You're listening to KZUM News on 89.3 KZUM Lincoln and KZUM HD. Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of KZUM News, an hour dedicated to learning more about what is going on in Lincoln and the surrounding areas. I am the news director and your host, Amantha Dickman.
My name is Rebecca Ford, KZUM's newsroom intern, and I will be your host for today. For this next story, I'll be here with you for our next news hour to discuss a subject that's hitting close to home for many. Policymaking impacts communities in many ways, and sometimes those policy decisions receive pushback. As of the administration change in January, Lincoln has experienced a noticeable surge in protests regarding that change and related policy changes on both a national and local level. In this story, we'll be listening to the testimonies of those that have participated in that pushback through protests, learning what motivates them and what they believe needs to be done going forward. Before we get into that, however, News Director Amantha Dickman sat down with Dr. Alexandria Putman, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Nebraska Wesleyan University, to learn more about what constitutes a protest and what drives people.
So, I know we've been talking a lot about protests the last couple weeks, obviously. There have been a whole bunch that have taken place here locally, and we're looking at more to come. There's already a whole calendar full for March through early June, as far as I can tell. So one of the things that I think it's important to talk about when we're looking at protests here locally is kind of identifying common themes. And one of the things that we have seen thematically across all of these protests are people talking about protesting the administration change. Now, as somebody who is in political science, you talk about politics a lot. So can you talk a little bit about what protesting in a political sense often looks like here locally?
Yeah. So in terms of local political protests, usually they're fairly small and in some ways much more organized events. Typically when we see protests, especially around organizational changes, or administration changes, rather, they tend to be very locally centered. So, for example, when President Obama took office, the Tea Party organized several small town hall type protests to protest his administration. Typically, when we see regular protest behavior in areas like this, more localized protest behavior, we're looking at things like town halls, or occasionally you'll see a march, or even I've seen recently where people are boycotting different industries or restaurants that support views that they're not as fond of. So generally, when we see protests on this scale, we're looking at something that's typically a little bit smaller, but maybe more frequent and functional in that way.
Sure. And, when we talk and look at administration change, it happens once every 4 years. So we have a nice sample size to kind of refer to in the past, but is that kind of, would political instability be a good term in this case for a protest?
Yeah, it would certainly cause a protest. Yeah, in some ways, protest around administration change is not uncommon. We can see after every major presidency, there's almost always a group that is not going to be pleased with the result. And so in a way, this is not an uncommon occurrence. I would say relatively, there are obviously things happening now politically that would warrant or would make us think that these protests are maybe a bit more than what they have previously. Like I said, Obama had some protests around his administration change, but they were fairly small. We've not seen this kind of consistency in a protest in a long time.
Sure. So, you're talking about comparing now to present protests that you see with administration change. I know we talk about, it seems like they're more frequent. It seems like they're happening with growing intensity. Do you think part of that is that they actually are growing in intensity and frequency, or do you think that we're just more aware of it because of the role social media plays in political awareness these days?
Yeah, so in some ways we are much more aware of it. If we think about like even further back in time, we go to like the 1970s, there were political protests happening all the time then, but people didn't necessarily know they were happening because, there's no way for them to know quickly. In some ways, there is an increased awareness now that would contribute to our kind of knowledge of these protests happening, and certainly would contribute to these kind of protests being organized more frequently. I think we can kind of see in some ways that the protests are more frequent now because of some other factors, certainly. But it is probably a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B on that one.
Sure. And one of the things that you have to consider when tracking protests, whether they be just politically related or not, is kind of identifying underlying causes of why people protest. Can you talk a little bit about what might motivate somebody to protest an administration?
Yeah, of course. So typically people protest to achieve some sort of organizational or policy change. Normally, a protest occurs because there is some problem that feels so great that people feel like the only way their voice will be heard is by this kind of large-scale collective movement, for lack of a better word. So in many ways, like people who contribute to these kinds of protest movements are looking to achieve a certain organizational outcome. I think if we think about some of the national level protests, we see this, like the upside down flags in Yosemite, for example. Those are very targeted at a specific policy change. I think what's different now is in Donald Trump's previous presidency, he had some protest behavior already occur. And so the groups that would typically be pushing to organize have already organized. So in some ways, we're seeing an escalation in this presidency because of the fact that these organizations already kind of exist and were ready to go when the new administration took over.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. That's something that I hadn't really considered when we were, working through all of the protest data that we were gathering for this story, was that a lot of those organizations already existed. They already had concrete missions in mind and could continue to build on that momentum. With that being said, we're kind of seeing this fluctuation in our current political environment that it's really hard to predict what's going to happen, what we're seeing here, and how policymaking is going to move forward, depending on pushback that this administration is receiving from the public, from even within their own organizations. What is your thoughts? What are your thoughts on how that kind of instability influences public perceptions and like attitudes towards protesting?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold, right? You have some people who are motivated by that instability, who I think see the struggle and the things happening in government and they're upset by it and want to see a change, and that drives them to protest and protest with much more strength. Like if we take like January 6th, for example, we consider that a protest movement in some ways. Like that is very much a situation where people felt like they had been denied a certain thing, like the election had been stolen. And because of that, they turned out to protest that kind of instability. On the other hand, we also see a lot of people who are kind of demoralized by the instability. They see what's happening in government and feel like nothing can be changed. And so in some ways, that kind of feeling can be inhibited or inhibitive of protest movements, because there are lots of people who probably do care a lot about what's going on, but don't maybe feel like protesting would be an efficient use of their time to pursue what they want. So it's kind of twofold in many ways.
Sure. And I'm glad you mentioned January 6th. It kind of plays into this talk about what constitutes as a protest. And I'm sure we probably should have started this conversation with that instead of, 15 minutes in. But protesting, seems to take a lot of different forms here in the United States, from, like you mentioned earlier, boycotts to anything up to a large scale protest at, say, like a Capitol. So, in your field, what constitutes as a protest exactly?
Yeah, so like you said, protests can mean a lot of different things. In many ways, it's hard as a political scientist to kind of determine what constitutes like a significant level of protest behavior. So generally, when we measure them, we measure specific types of protest behavior. We'll separate out between like boycotts, which would be considered protest behavior, but perhaps maybe like a lower strength level of protest,
Mhm.
versus like the top end, where you obviously see like January 6th and those kinds of protests that are obviously much larger physical protest movements. I think that tends to be the biggest dividing line is the like the online protest versus the like physical in-person protest. That tends to be how we divide those up. But mostly a protest for us would be really anything that is done in opposition to the government to achieve that kind of social change. So there are some people who, like me, study just like straight up boycotts and that's it. And other people focus more intensely on the kind of more severe protest behavior.
I think that's really interesting. Your primary differentiation there is between online and physical. Do you have like a hierarchy where you also are considering factors of, say, intensity in terms of violence, or number of attendees, and those kinds of factors?
Yeah, so when we do like regression analysis, which would be more kind of like causal determinations of how protest behavior happens, those are some of the things we look at. How many people are involved, what kinds of conduct occur, and how many groups show up. For example, like during 2020, we see like the Black Lives Matter protests. In that scenario, we're looking at both like the kind of nationwide scale, like how many places are protesting? Are they protesting all at the same time? Are they linked to a specific event or person? In those cases, we have a question about like physical harm or like business harm, which become questions. Really, like anything you could possibly think will go into a protest behavior, we probably have data on and measure quite frequently. Uh, I don't know that we have an explicit hierarchy of how these things work out. I'm sure I personally have kind of like an internalized hierarchy of like this is the bottom level of severeness, this is the top level. But I've yet to see any, I think, publishable paper determining that yet. Maybe I'll write it next time.
And maybe hierarchy isn't exactly the right term here. Maybe categorization is the better term, because I don't want to, um, I don't want to say that those less intense protests aren't meaningful, or don't serve their purpose. That's not what I'm trying to say when I use the term hierarchy there. But you, Dr. Putman, you study boycotts. You've mentioned that before. Um, it's a little harder to track boycotts compared to physical protests. Do you find that to be the case in your area of expertise?
Absolutely. So to be clear, I study specifically, I study like partisanship in Congress. So I'm very concerned
Oh,
about
cool.
like how laws get passed. And so my expertise in this field comes from like knowledge of how these protest movements impact legislation. In some ways, boycotts are a really effective form. Like you said, I certainly don't want to give the impression that boycotts and like online protest behavior is any less important because it is super important. They're important in different ways, I guess. Like boycotts, for example, usually affect economic outcomes. You think like Target, for example, I saw recently has a 10-day boycott coming up. I think it started today. Maybe. Maybe it was in Georgia, which is my home state. But um, in that scenario, companies like Target take a big hit when they have like thousands and thousands of people refusing to shop there. And I think those kinds of um, protest behaviors are really effective when dealing with the kinds of change that are intrinsically tied to like corporate attitudes, one would say.
Mhm. And so you mentioned that a lot of your research focuses on, how these movements affect lawmaking. So, just something I've noticed is that we've seen several occasions of this current administration saying they're going to do something, they get some pushback, and then they kind of back off on that concept. Would you say that those two things are correlated?
I would think so. So one of the biggest things we talk about in like my intro classes is that the power of like a president, for example, or its largest power is really the power to persuade people. The presidency is highly nationalized. We're talking about like the biggest character in the party. And so in many ways, I think the actual public perception of the presidency and of Congress generally, it matters a lot to the way they actually legislate. While we don't always consciously observe it, they are, I think, sometimes afraid of public opinion and what the public might do. One of the most famous guys in political science said, David Mayhew, in his dissertation, no less, said congressmen are single-minded seekers of re-election. And when they think that they're going to lose election, they get really scared. And so, for example, like the TikTok ban, that's one of those times where we can see like they were very, very consistent about having the TikTok ban, and then they were not consistent after quite a lot of public backlash. I think this is certainly not abnormal. Their power is largely based on the public. And so when the public no longer supports them in these really big foundational ways, they'll notice. Now, the question is like, is it the public that they're paying attention to that will make the change?
And Dr. Putman, I guess, seeing all these protests talking about the way that, leaders rely on public perception in a lot of ways, do you think that protests are effective? I know that's a really kind of dumbed down question and it's really basic, but do you think a lot of these protests that we're currently seeing are effective for, making that change that groups are hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I certainly think they are. It may not always feel like it, because it's hard to push for and see that really substantive policy change. And I think for many, it can be a demoralizing process to protest and then not see that change quickly. I do think that they are effective in some ways. The kinds of changes that people are pushing for do make a really substantive impact on the kinds of rhetoric we see, even when talking about like Donald Trump during COVID and 2020 and all of that stuff. We can see really drastically how his behavior and mannerisms towards the public change once we start to see large-scale protests against him during the election. I think they can. It is really just a question of where they are and how televised it is in some ways. Like some of the most effective protests that I've seen were like the ones in the 1970s, where we see like people in the LGBTQ community and people of color protesting together. Those were really like moving, impactful moments for the United States that did fundamentally push policy forward. I think in many ways we still see that behavior. It's just harder because we don't see the effect as quickly.
Sure. That was another thing I was going to ask was, we are in an era where we have access to all of this technology, and we see protests, even if they're not necessarily here in the United States, we see protesting of some variety happening worldwide almost all the time. Do you think that seeing that kind of political action has desensitized people to the conversation surrounding protests? I know Kendrick Lamar's halftime performance at the Super Bowl is in many ways was a protest of this current in political environment. And it seemed like a lot of the conversation that was happening there was more about the artistic value of his performance and less about what he was saying. So that's kind of why I'm asking if you think technology has played a role at all in desensitizing folks.
Yeah, of course. I mean, in many ways, I think technology has really changed our relationship to the political world we live in. Um, you think like I'm glad you brought up like the Kendrick Lamar performance. I think like that's one of those scenarios where I think we see so much of it all the time. And for some people, they, not all people, but there are some people out there who believe that political protest or the kinds of things that people are talking about now aren't worth like talking about, or people believe that people are complaining about these things and that it doesn't matter. I mean, the truth is it does. I think in some circles, this kind of political protest just isn't valued in the same way. And so there are certainly groups who've been very desensitized against the kind of collective social change that was much more commonplace in the 1900s. By the same token, I would also say like social media increases what we call like effective polarization. It's this idea that like for viewers and all others, that people feel really strongly about politics now. In fact, they have really strong negative feelings about the other party, and that often helps frame and builds people to believe very negative things about people in their out group. I think the age of like social media and online activity has made this worse. And so the people who don't agree with the political protests are the same people who feel very, very strongly that they don't agree with the groups who are protesting. In many ways, I think like that, we can attribute a lot of that to the advent of the internet.
Sure. So, and maybe this is a question that you don't want to answer, you don't have an answer for, and that's totally fine. How do we work to overcome that divide? How do we work to kind of build that gap as somebody who's, studying the impact that this has on our government and our political climate?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard. I teach political parties. I just taught political parties last week. And it's one of the things I study is like polarization and how we kind of fix this world that we live in. And in some ways, I wish I had a better answer, but we've gotten really polarized, and everything I know about partisan theory leads me to believe that we kind of either have to realign or something has to change, because I think there are a lot of people in this country who don't feel represented by what is happening and want to see a change in this kind of polarization, but don't really know how to participate or cause that change because it's just so much. It's so daunting of a thing to do. So I wish I knew. That's $1 million question.
I was about to say, I know that's kind of one of those big world questions that is really hard to answer, especially when you're looking at it through a local lens. And it's a bit of a chicken egg situation, right? Like, you've got problems, people are protesting, the protesting leads to more problems because there's a miscommunication and hyperpolarization happening there. So I appreciate that you at least, had thoughts that you could share with listeners on it. And then I don't have any other questions for you this afternoon, Dr. Putman, but do you have anything you'd like to say about local protests or kind of the culture surrounding protests and how that affects our political environment?
Yeah, I mean, I can say broadly, as somebody who speaks to students a lot and talks to them a lot about how to be involved in politics, I can say with a lot of certainty that these protests are valuable. It's incredibly important to get involved in your local spaces, whether it be like joining the League of Women Voters or going out and participating in our different like nonpartisan organizations. Like if you feel dissatisfied by politics in the way that it is now, there are places that you can go and get represented. There are protests that you can join. And that is still valuable, even if it doesn't feel like you're achieving the outcome yet that you want. I promise that it is still incredibly worth it to participate in those ways.
Well, thank you so much for telling us more about local protests and kind of the environment that we're looking at right now. We appreciate you taking time to sit down with us.
Of course, I hope that it was informative.
We just finished speaking with Dr. Ali Putman, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Nebraska Wesleyan University, regarding what constitutes a protest and what drives people to protest. We're now coming up on our first break of the hour. After a few messages, we will return to sit down with two students from Nebraska Wesleyan University to discuss their experiences attending protests. Go grab a snack, a drink, and we'll be right back.
Support for KZUM comes from Lincoln Pharmacy, a local neighborhood pharmacy located at 33rd and A Streets, offering medication therapy management, medical supplies, citywide prescription delivery, vaccinations, and more. Open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. More information at lincoln-rx.com.
And by
No Coast Roller Derby, a skater-owned and operated nonprofit organization since 2005. The opening event of the 2025 season is February 22nd at the Lincoln Sports Foundation Complex at 7600 North 70th Street. Doors open at 4 and the bout starts at 5 p.m. Tickets and more information are available at nocoastrollerderby.com.
Your Malone Community Center continues to be a cornerstone of cultural, educational, and social programming. The center is home to an out-of-school program. The lead agency for 2 community learning centers hosts a weekly food distribution service along with other programs. For more information on the Malone Community Center, please contact our office at 402-474-1110 or go to our website www.maloncenter.org. Celebrating the heritage of service since 1955, Your Malone Community Center.
Welcome back to today's episode of KZUM News. I'm Rebecca Ford, KZUM's newsroom intern and your host. Before the break, we spoke with Dr. Alexandria Putman, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Nebraska Wesleyan University, about what constitutes a protest and what drives people to protest. Now, we'll be sitting down with Skye Putman and Taylor Haysbrook, 2 social work students at Nebraska Wesleyan University, about their protest experiences. Both students attended the march at Trago Park on Wednesday, January 29th. The march was a general protest pushing it back against policy regarding deportation and immigration, bodily autonomy, climate change, and a number of other issues. Skye Putman also attended the counter-protest for the annual Nebraska Walk for Life March, organized by Nebraska Right for Life on Saturday, February 1st, and she speaks to that experience in her interview.
Well, first of all, focusing on the march at Trago Park on Wednesday, how did you both hear about that?
We had a fellow student that is doing their practicum at Lincoln Literacy. She posted on her story about the protest, and then we talked about it, and we decided that we were going to attend.
Awesome. What motivated you to attend? I know, obviously that person posted on the story, but how does this issue affect you, or what was the motivation?
So, being NASW Nebraska interns, we're working a lot with legislation, with bills, and it's been really difficult to see the harmful impacts that these bills can have. And unfortunately, there's quite a few of them.
Right.
So just knowing that we can be involved in advocacy and making social change and just advocating for social justice.
Right. Can you describe to me the events that happened on Wednesday, what all the protest entailed, time, things, basic details like that?
It started at 4 in Trago Park, and from there we took a path down below the one bridge. What bridge is that?
It's the bridge on O Street. O Street goes above it, and then there's a big green space / I believe it's actually part of Trago Park over there.
Yeah. And then we walked up O Street, and then we took a left turn and headed towards the Capitol.
Is that where the protest ended? Was that the Capitol?
Yes. We all kind of rallied there at the end. That was kind of our end checkpoint. So it was about a 1.5 to 2 mile walk. So if anyone wasn't physically able to walk or just didn't want to walk, they could meet us at the Capitol.
Gotcha. Perfect. How many people did it seem like attended, if you could estimate?
I personally am terrible at estimating, but probably between 100 and 150
Gotcha.
once everybody kind of gathered there.
Yeah, I would say probably upwards a little over 100. Once we first all were in the park, it looked like a smaller group, but once we were walking, there were other people that joined while we were walking.
Did they join, do you think they knew about it in advance, or did they just see something was going on and they wanted to be a part of it?
I think they knew about it in advance because some of them were carrying flags and posters as well.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, on that note, what were some of the activities that happened on the march? Did you guys have any chants? I saw a short video of people dancing. So yeah, can you describe me the energy, what was going on?
Yeah, it was very, very energized.
Yeah.
We kind of had people throughout. I mean, we kind of got spread out as we went on our walk and crossing O Street and stuff. So we had people at various points in our walk leading different chants, which was really, really cool. There were a plethora of different chants and stuff. Some people played music. There was a lot of singing and dancing, especially when we got to the Capitol. I was there. I saw people in the middle. They were all dancing, carrying their flags. So it was really, really great. I mean, obviously we were there protesting against something that wasn't so great, but people there in general were happy and in high spirits.
Right. Sorry, I'm just checking the time so I can write down the timestamp. That's a good quote. Yeah, so it almost sounds like to me it was, like you said, it was obviously still a protest, but it also sounds like it was a big celebration to an extent. Yeah, you find that an apt description.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone there was so nice that we talked to. I mean, people handing out bottles of water and hand warmers once the sun started to go down.
Very nice.
There was a woman in her van that circled 3 times just supporting us, and then the third time she brought a ton of cases of water and handed those all out. So yeah, everyone was great.
It really felt like a chance for a community to come together. People that I've never met before from that really young ages. There were young kids there with their parents, and then from all the way to elderlies were there together protesting for the same outreach and trying to gain attention, which I fully believe that there are power in numbers and that it gains positive attention, and it's how we get places.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you sort of tell me the issues that were being protested?
So there was one woman that put all of this together. So she put together a Canva page that talked about all of the different issues that we were specifically protesting. So that was being against climate change and all of the harmful legislation that has been introduced regarding that, and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, things like that. Pro-life. Talking a lot about keeping ICE out of our schools, out of our hospitals, out of our churches, and how no one is illegal on stolen land.
Gotcha. Would you say that's a lot of political instability that's sort of been brought up by the recent administration? Or do you think these are issues that might be, coming back because of the administration, but always... I mean, we've seen these protests for a long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've been seeing these protests for a long time, and at some point we made positive steps towards overcoming these issues. And I do think with our current administration, a lot of those have been taken away. So I think that's just led to more and more protests. It's unfortunate that we have to protest. I mean, I feel like we're happy to do it, but it is unfortunate that we have to protest more and more now because of harmful legislation being pushed by current administration.
Right. How, can you describe to me how you felt at the protest? Were you both there for the entire time? And describe to me just, what it was like being at that protest, being affected by the issues that were being protested, anything like that.
I left a little bit early because the sun was going down and I was getting really cold. But while I was there, I felt really empowered. There was so many people around me, and the air was filled with just this positive energy. And I remember just standing up, in front of the Capitol. I stood on top of the one, ledge, just right there, held my little sign, and I just, felt so free and just, so happy to be doing something meaningful.
Right.
And although, I'm just one person with one voice, at least my voice was, being heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very empowering, I think, and it just felt very great to be a part of active advocacy, and especially with Nebraska being a red state, just seeing how many people showed up to protest against these issues was amazing. And like Taylor mentioned earlier, I have never met these people in my life, and yet we're all here for the same issue, and everyone was just so kind, so caring. Everyone looked out for each other. The energy there was awesome, and it stayed a peaceful protest the whole time, which was something that was really important to everyone that attended. But yeah, it felt really great to be a part of something that felt very impactful, especially standing on the actual stairs of the Capitol.
Right.
And then my brother was there to take photos, so we walked across the street, and just seeing everyone standing in front of the Capitol from across the street with all of their signs and their flags, and just hearing them was just the greatest thing ever.
Right.
And there were cars driving by and people honking in a good way to support us. So yeah, it was great. It was awesome.
What do you think the goals of this protest was?
Ultimately to make change, and I feel like that's such a basic answer, but ultimately to make change, but also I think it was also to show that Nebraska does have a blue dot. We do have those people who are fighting for human rights for everyone. So I think it was really, really important that everyone showed up for every single issue, no matter what it was, but to show people that, okay, we do care about these issues, and there's a plethora of them that we care about, and it's important. We should be talking about these things. It can be difficult, but we should be talking about them.
And I believe that the state senators, they're in the legislative hearings right now, and not everyone is able to make it during the day, so going to a protest like this after people are getting off work, they're walking out at the end of the day, and they're walking past it, they're hearing it, they're taking note of what they're hearing. So I believe that it will impact them later on when these bills are trying to be passed and they're listening to these hearings.
Right. What bills specifically, if you know of any, are being protested, or what do you think are the big issues that? It's okay if you don't know for sure. I would just be interested if
LD
you know.
89.
Unfortunately, we do know. It's unfortunate that we do know. Please go ahead.
LD 89 is this Friday at 1:30. They're doing the hearing. If you want to talk about it, you can.
So LB 89 is essentially an anti-transgender and anti-woman bill that's being pushed for bathroom rules of who can use what bathroom, who can be in what locker rooms, but then all the way to who can participate in what extracurricular activities, including sports teams. And they call it the Stand With Women Act, and it...
Don't let the one-liners fool you, because they're so fooling. You need to do a little bit of research of what the bill actually incites in it.
Yeah, it's really not a very long bill. But that one is very important, because that could change a lot of things in Nebraska for people who are transgender and for women in general. And it's going to the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee, which is very interesting because typically a bill like this would not go to a committee like that, because each committee is essentially responsible for their own jurisdiction of things.
Right.
So we do have a Health and Human Services Committee, which is typically where a bill like that would go. So that is kind of throwing us off too, because the senators who are on that committee are the ones ultimately at that hearing. So, very, very important, but it's also important to advocate against bills like LB 89. Anyone can enter in a comment online against this bill. Anyone can attend this hearing in person on Friday. But it's just really important to talk about.
Yeah. What do you think right now what do you think Nebraskans need to do moving forward? What direction do you think our community should go in? For what reasons? I know that's kind of a broad question, but if Nebraskans are to take action, what do you think they should be doing to better, our economy, our communities, anything like that?
I honestly think it's as simple as using the voice that you have. Being a white person, I have privilege that other people don't. I have a voice that other people don't, so I'm going to use it to the best of my ability. And anyone can use their voice against bills, against harmful legislation, against harmful policies that are happening right now.
Right.
And that can look like word of mouth, just educating yourself and then educating others on what you've learned and what the realities are of certain issues. That could look like posting on social media your accurate sources, obviously, but posting on social media and spreading the word that way. You can connect to so many people on the internet that you're not able to in person. That could look like writing letters for or against certain bills. It is as easy as typing up something less than 500 words and submitting it online. You could go and you could protest. Like, there are so many different things that people can do to get involved, but ultimately I think it starts with educating yourself, because we don't know what we don't know, and there's a lot of things that people can learn. So I think educating yourself first is kind of the most important step for everyone, anywhere, honestly.
One second. Okay. Great. I want to switch gears. Was this your first protest that you've ever attended, or have you attended ones in the past?
It was my first protest that I've attended. Back in 2020, when all the other protests happened, I was living way out in a small town, so not much was happening out there. So being here in Lincoln now, where I can actually do something, means a lot to me.
I had only attended one protest prior, and it was for the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was a few years ago. And then the one in Trago Park was my second, and then I went to my third, was that counter protest, the Walk for Life counter protest.
Yeah, can you tell me about that experience too?
Yes.
Yeah, starting off, that was on Saturday, right?
Yes.
What time was that?
It started at 10 in the morning.
Right. Oof, too early.
It was very early, and it was very cold.
Oh.
A lot of people still showed up. On the anti-choice side. On the pro-choice side, there weren't as many of us, unfortunately, but I do know of some people who were planning on going and then decided not to for their own safety. So that was also a big concern. So I cannot blame anyone who didn't go, especially for their safety. But there were quite a few anti-choice folks there.
Right.
There were a lot. So it was.
I know you said you're bad at estimating, but could you estimate?
Oh my gosh, there were probably like 200 to 250 maybe. But yes, it was like a sea of people. It was very overwhelming.
From my understanding, this is a recurring yearly walk, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. They've been doing it for about 50 years. So they have been doing it for a long time. So they get permits to walk in the streets and stuff. So they have essentially police escorts on the way to their final destination, because they start at the Capitol, then they do a little walk to their final destination.
Do you know what that final destination was?
They ended up meeting at, I believe it was called like the Cornhusker Marriott Hotel.
Okay, yes.
Downtown. It was probably about 1.5 miles or 2 away from the Capitol.
Gotcha.
But I went on their website prior to this. So they had posted their map of walking and said that they would all meet at this hotel and that they would have booths and networking opportunities and things like that. So I'm not quite sure what happened after they all left the Capitol, but yes, I was there at the Capitol.
How did you hear about the counter protest?
I heard about it through a peer. And it's kind of funny because once you hear one thing about it, at least in my experience, then it's suddenly popping up everywhere. I'm like, oh wow, I have heard about that. So it was kind of word of mouth at first, and then I slowly started seeing people post things about it and things on Facebook, on Instagram. So
could you describe to me kind of like what you talked about with the Wednesday protest? Can you tell me about the energy on both sides of the protest?
On the pro-choice side, we definitely tried to keep it more lighthearted and upbeat. Even though there was a small group of us, we were all kind of encouraging each other and making sure that each other stayed safe. So we kind of had a small community in that, which was really, really cool. And everyone was super nice. We even had one person who just continued to yell at the top of their lungs over and over again. And I had a good laugh about it, and then they turned around and they were like, I'm so sorry, am I annoying anyone? So even just little things like that. We're at a protest, and these people are still kind. The other side was a little different. I used to refer to them as pro-life, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to paint that in a positive light, because it's truly not. So that's why I keep referring to them as the anti-choicers or the anti-choice group. But their energy was slightly off-putting at times. A lot of them would kind of walk, because we had our own designated area to be in that was set up for our safety.
Okay.
There were little barriers put up, so we knew exactly where we were supposed to be, stayed there the whole time, so we were separated, which was good. But yeah, just people from that side coming over and taking photos and recording us, which we're in a public space. I don't have an issue with you taking a photo or recording, but just knowing that it probably didn't have the best intentions behind it was kind of disappointing, I suppose. Plenty of churches had showed up and were asking for donations and things. So they kind of had their own community in that, which I love for them. They have their own people, their own community. But there was a small group of 3 people who did come up to us at the end and were framing it like they were just simply trying to ask us questions and to educate themselves, and then every time they would kind of rebuttal, it just became very clear that they were not necessarily trying to educate themselves and more just trying to push their point. So that was frustrating too, because then even after I said, okay, we're done with the conversation, he continued to talk over me, which was frustrating because of, number one, the reason that we're there, but number two, the fact that, like, I'm asking you to stop and to please just, like, take a step back, and the fact that you're not respecting that is not okay.
Right.
So it was a very different energy than the first one, for sure.
Right. What was do you think there was a distinct goal with this kind of protest, or just to show up as opposition? What was, the purpose?
Ultimately, it was to disrupt what they have been doing for 50 years.
Yep.
Part of advocating for social change is disrupting, and not in a non-peaceful way or by any means, but it was to go and to show that your side is not the only side, and if your side gets to be represented in this space, then our side gets to be represented in the same space. And we didn't interrupt or stop their walk or impede in any way like that, but just being there and having them have to listen to our voices was good enough for me.
Well, just starting to wrap up, I have one more question I want from both of you. Sorry that you're okay. Do you guys see yourselves involving yourself in more protests or marches in the future, or playing a role in organizing or dispersing of information? Where do you guys see yourselves in these issues?
I do plan on attending more protests. It gives me I feel more like self-assurance, like within myself, knowing that I am doing something and I am making a small difference. And I know with this internship that me and Sky are doing, we have a lot of work that we're advocating for the bills. We're watching everything that's happening within the legislative system. So yeah, I know that we will have a presence there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I plan on going to a protest tomorrow. I believe tomorrow is Wednesday, February 5th.
Yeah.
But they're they're calling it 50-51, 50 states, 50 capitals, one day. So I have heard from a couple different sources. Ours is at 4 p.m. So I will be attending that one. So I definitely plan to attend any future ones that I hear about. Because it's been a really great experience. It's also been impactful for me too, because so many different people from so many different walks of life show up, and it's like, if anything, like, we all have something in common here. So I love seeing the community come together for really good things. But yeah, and like Taylor said, writing letters for and against bills and testifying, and just continuing to stay active in advocacy.
We just finished speaking with Sky Putman and Taylor Haysbrook, two social work students at Nebraska Wesleyan University, about their protest experiences attending the march at Trago Park on Wednesday, January 29th, and the counter-protest for the annual Nebraska Walk for Life March organized by Nebraska Right to Life on Saturday, February 1st. Next week, we'll speak with 3 more protesters about their experiences attending protests. In times like these, we are very much divided. We all have a stake in the issues that impact us the most. Everyone has a justification for their decisions, and everyone has the right to make their voice heard. In our pursuit to engage in good faith, however, we must not forget that listening is a part of this conversation. Thank you for listening.
We are fast approaching the end of the hour, so here are your reminders for today. The KZUM Newsroom is always open to hearing about any questions, concerns, suggestions, or even any story ideas that you might want to share with us. All you have to do is give us a call at 402-474-5086, extension line 6. If you give us a call and we aren't available, don't forget to leave a voicemail. Or, if you aren't much of a phone person, you can also find our social media handles, and more newsroom information at kzum.org under that About tab. Speaking of our website, if you happen to miss a show, you can always head to the KZUM News tab, where we archive all of our shows and include a transcript with links to that day's content. And lastly, I just want to give a shout out to Jack Rodenberg of the Rodenberg Music Experience. He put together all of the amazing original music that our news program uses. So once again, thank you, Jack. That wraps up our reminders for now. As you head out into the world, I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. You just finished listening to KZUM News, an original production of KZUM Radio that airs every Saturday at 11 a.m. Coming up next is Beta Radio, so stay tuned.